Hi everyone and welcome. We're down here in my wormery and I've got a couple red wiggler worm bins that need to be fed. That includes the one over here on the left on the lower shelf. It's 56 days of age at this point. And the one over here, this one's 87 days of age. And it's been a week since they were both fed, so they're due for some food. And the other bin that needs some attention is the one that's up here, the one with no label on it. The one with no label is kind of in a finishing stage right now. I'm trying to bait out any remaining worms that might be in that material. And at some point pretty soon, in the next week or two, I'm estimating, this material should be pretty much free of worms. We will have baited the majority of them out. And then that material can just go into a bucket, go into storage, and then that'll free up that bin for other purposes. So we're going to begin with that one. Whatever worms we collect from there, we'll be releasing into the bin that we feed down here, the newest of my bins, and we'll have to see if there's still a bunch of worms in this material cruising around within the castings. We might reset the bait bomb. If we find that there's no worms anymore, maybe we'll just consider that container as done, and then we'll be finished with that one. So we're going to start here. Let's get this one up on the bench and see how we're coming along. Before we get the first bin out here, a moment ago you might have noticed this up on the shelf along with the worm bins. This was just my little cheat sheet here showing which bins we're going to be working on, and just shows what their ages are. The F down here means food, feed basically, and the question mark alongside this one is, do we feed it again, try to continue baiting worms, or have we got all the worms evacuated? And maybe F just means finish, and then we'll just be able to harvest those castings. All right, let's get that bin up here. Okay, now we've been trying to work our way to the point where the outlying material around the feeding zone has a chance to air out, ventilate, dry out a little bit, and the baiting area is where we're focusing all of this moisture retention by placing the plastic over that, so that the recirculating moisture underneath the plastic creates a nice damp space for the worms to hang out. You can see one worm hanging out here on the top, enjoying the recirculating moisture. I guess since we're in here to evict worms, let's just make sure this little guy is in here. Let's see if we're harboring any other fugitives in the folds of this piece of paper. But if they're that desperate to hide and evade capture, I'm not going to push the matter. Leave them be. Let's take a quick examination of how things are progressing in here. We'll pull this baiting station out quickly and then try to see how things look around the perimeter of the hole. See if there's any worms that we need to quickly capture before they squirm away into the material. I did not see any. The material right here alongside the baiting station's got a nice moisture level to it. I thought I saw a little tiny baby worm. I am seeing, yep, little tiny baby worms. This has been our expectation from the get-go. Our numerous efforts at separating the worms from the castings have included numerous migrations for all of the adult worms. And the main reason we've been allowing time for this bin to get finalized is because we're anticipating that the bin is loaded with worm cocoons that are still yet to hatch, with baby worms on the way in great numbers. And I believe that we're just starting to see the signs of that, with all little tiny worms all over the place within this material. And I start to peel back further, moving away from the feeding area. Once in a while, we're going to encounter a slightly larger worm here and there, I guess. But I'm definitely seeing a good number of little tiny baby worms, which I'm not going to try to pick out individually, one by one. Let's just see if we can get a little sampling of that here. Let's see if I try to hold still. Do we see anything? I can see a little guy squirming right there, trying to get out of the light. The tip of another one right over here. Very, very minute little critters. Probably just recently hatched. And pretty much all over the place. So this material obviously has a ways to go before we can consider it as depopulated and ready for harvest, and that's fine. We're not in a hurry. By no means. We're actually completely unbound by time on this one. I've got my garden all planted, and we could really, go the distance on trying to evacuate the worms from this bin. We don't have to rush through the process and leave a whole bunch of little guys behind. And like I've said before, it certainly doesn't matter if you do. Worms that end up in your finished compost will ultimately end up out in your garden when you plant. And there they only do good for your dirt, for your plants. So we're going to empty the contents of this into here. We're going to reload this bait bomb and let this thing continue as is. And we'll check again in another week or so. So we'll see how many worms we were able to collect. I got a couple more still lingering here in this cage. Let's see what I could do to coerce them out of this lovely goop that they're living in. It's just probably just a mush consisting of the food that was given to them. And it's not the end of the world if I miss one or two. This process will continue. Whatever worms came along for the ride here, we can release them, get them back into service. They're not liking this light, so they're all fleeing. I'm going to try to get them back into the this pile. Hopefully they'll find a nice, safe, dark spot. We'll release these guys shortly once we get the other bins out here. So I guess to keep things going here, we usually throw a little bit of bedding down into the bottom of the box, and this material here would certainly serve well as bedding if it's no longer usable as a cover type material. We'll hang on to that, but we'll use all the rest of this material here as a little bit of bedding to throw in here. Maybe we'll mix in a leaf or two, another piece of paper, maybe a little bit of grit, a pinch of this, a pinch of that, maybe a little bit of coffee, and I would think a few chunks of cantaloupe rind would definitely get their attention, and maybe a piece of this carrot that started going bad. Any other little scraps of bedding type material I could throw in here, I'll just pile it on top. Why don't I use just a little bit more leafy material here to cap things off a little bit. Should make for a pretty appealing baiting zone. Just sink this thing right back down into the spot where it was. And all these little baby worms will hopefully find their way there. "42 days, so 6 weeks. Yeah, I guess that's it's a good start, but definitely going to need more time as these little baby worms start to emerge from their cocoons. Give them time to make their way over. We'll try to keep fishing them out of here, but at some point we'll just leave the rest of them to be. Kind of flimsy on the paper. We'll go ahead and we'll allocate one of my coffee filters to the cause. Always worked good as a napkin too in a makeshift situation. Once again, you can see I'm continuing to just focus the evaporation zone under the plastic here in the middle and letting the rest of it air out, let it start drying out a little bit. All right. Looking good. Let's move on to feeding the other bins. So now, with this bin nearing its 2-month birthday, so I'm getting harder and harder to consider it as my newest bin. I'm definitely due for the creation of another new bin, since I've got a couple active worm bins that are in the process of trying to migrate the worms out. And I need a place to put those guys once they all come together. So I will be creating at least one new bin in the very near future to have a place to release all the gathered worms that I'm trying to migrate now. Wow, I love the way it looks underneath here. Just piles and piles of fresh castings in every direction all over the top surface. A lot of worms coming up to enjoy the moisture, and that's why there's so many castings. It's just something I'm still getting used to seeing because it's kind of a novelty for me. It only started happening when I started using plastic to cover up the material in my bins. So I'm still sort of taken aback by this. I was always jealous of people watching their videos when they would open their bins and you would just see a coating of fresh castings across the top. I always thought to myself, wow, how cool would it be? How come I don't get that? And it was basically because I just had slightly too dry conditions, especially on the top surface of my bins. When I was still using materials that allowed the moisture to wick through and evaporate away and escape, leaving the top surface a little bit inhospitable, a little bit too dry for the worms. The plastic that I use nowadays creates almost perfect moisture level. And the nice thing is that the moisture in here doesn't cause anything to clump up. You would think, oh, doesn't that moisture just kind of build up and become unmanageable after time? You know, if that was true, you would kind of pull out a chunk of material and you can even see it glistening. It's so damp. But even so, it crumbles apart pretty good. This stuff would definitely benefit from, you know, having a little chance to air out over time once it gets to that stage. But right now I'm trying to promote, you know, a lot of breakdown, a lot of consumption, and the more moist it is, the better you can promote that sort of activity. Down low, there's all kinds of bedding. There's bedding just scattered throughout the material. Various chunks of food here and there, sticks, stems. Okay, now I'm remembering there was a huge number of Brussels sprouts added, and I just found one of them, and this does not feel like it's been broken down very much at all. It feels actually kind of hard and tough. So I wonder if that is like a type of material that might require a little bit of time before the worms can finally get into it. If so, then they've probably just been bypassing it, looking for foods that they can consume right away. Just waiting for that Brussels sprout material to get to that point. I mean, I do see certain Brussels sprouts, like this one, you know, full of worms in and out of it. So yeah, I don't think we're delayed at all. For whatever reason, this one just didn't seem like it was very popular. So besides Brussels sprouts, from what I believe was the last feeding of this bin, we've also got other older things in here, like this seed from a mango. I always try to give one of these things a little squeeze to see if I can deform it, squash it, but it's still too rigid for that. When I can, I'll often cut the mango in half so that the seed is cut open, making it easier for the worms to get in. But yeah, most of these Brussels sprouts are definitely being consumed already. Except that one, it's still very rigid and hard. There's no shortage of food in here. Look at this. Even the old pumpkin stem in here is pretty popular. It's making me question whether I need to add food today. I mean, there's clearly stuff in here, but I mean, you look at mango seeds, you look at pumpkin stems, a lot of these things are very rigid, very slow composting materials. So alongside those types of things, I do like to regularly feed softer, more readily available foods so that they can continue feasting while that other material also gets consumed, but not quite as quickly. It's not a race. Here's another sort of experimental object. It's a peach pit, very hard, rigid item. I do always see one or two worms hanging out on it for whatever reason. Not sure if it's because they're eating it or they just like the fact that it's hard and rough. surface. I am sort of piling up the material here, going outbound or outboard of the feeding area. I'm trying to make ourselves a little bit of space so that we can add at least a little bit of food. I don't want to get this far and then abandon the feeding. Even if it's just a little bit of food, I would like to try to get it in here. But it might also be necessary at some point soon to make a decision on how we're going to cope with the space constraints in here. We can only go so far. At some point we just have to decide that we're at our capacity level and that we've got to start steering the activity in the bin towards completion, or think about relocating these little guys into something slightly larger, give them a little bit more space to operate. I have not yet decided what to do here yet. If I get too many bins at once, you know, gearing up for harvest, kind of starving certain bins or whatever, you know, I ultimately really diminish my capability of vermicomposting my kitchen scraps and my compostable materials. The stuff would just start piling up if I had nowhere to put it. So the fact that I've got a new bin coming online soon, that'll help relieve the strain a little bit from that perspective. So a little bit of a balancing act here, but I believe we've managed to create enough space here if the worms don't squirm it apart very quickly for us to throw in a little bit of bedding, add our food for the day, and get this thing closed up. And then before we finish, let's not forget we want to also release the worms we gathered from the finishing tub. So really quick, we're going to grab ourselves a handful of leaves here. We're going to use that as kind of the foundation, a nice little bedding base for the food. I'll throw in some coffee. And some grit, because the grit is probably what these little baby worms are most interested in. So let's get these little guys released. Make sure we didn't leave any behind. Get them all in here. Now we have a chance to quickly examine how many worms we were able to round up. And then they'll probably scoot out of view shortly. Got a fair number of them hanging out here on this banana peel. This is kind of a mushy, gooey substance. Whatever it was that they were fed here is also got a whole bunch of little tiny worms hanging out within it. What else is this? Some other sort of half of a mango seed, some sort of a veggie. Not an earth-shattering result, but at least we're keeping tabs on how that evacuation is progressing. Let's get the rest of the feeding into here. Here's a carrot with a piece of bedding frozen to it, little paper towel. So we'll just include both right there. Here's a banana peel. There's another carrot. We'll give them some cantaloupe as well. Okay. We don't have to go too overboard. We saw plenty of remains of the previous feedings still lingering in here. And even though it seems to be a fairly busy bin, I don't think that there's a worry about food running out anytime soon in here. So we'll just start laying everything back in here. Some of these experimental items, we'll put the peach pit over here. We'll put some of these slow composting items back in. Some mango seeds. The Brussels sprouts, I don't know. I fished out what I found, but I didn't find that many, and I thought that I had placed quite a few in here, so maybe they've managed to break the majority of them down already. But whatever ones I did manage to fish out, I'm just positioning them right back in the feeding zone at this point, so we can start closing up shop here. Just trying to bring the level back down, because I did pile this up quite high, especially on this side over here. Nice, busy, active bin. It's my newest bin, so the newest bin by default always gets whatever worms I'm able to round up when I'm trying to depopulate and stuff like that. So not surprising that this is where I keep dumping new worms that I collect when I'm trying to evacuate another bin. So the numbers keep gradually growing as I keep adding population each time I do one of those kind of relocations. But pretty soon I'll have a newer bin, and that'll be really my new focus for relocating worms into, should I need to do so. And then this one might actually be, you know, ready to get geared up for harvest soon. I don't know, I've got to decide. I got to decide if I'm going to be keeping them in here or if I'm going to be getting them into something a little bit larger. I'm going to cover up with a little bit of leafy material here on top. I just kind of feel sometimes like I'm a little stingy when it comes to the bedding materials, that I should probably include more than I do. Let's also grab one of our coffee filters to cover up with. Show us where the feeding zone is. All right, very nice. Covering back up gently here. Trying not to make a mess with all these castings. Once they dry a little bit, they flake right off the plastic bag, go flying all over the place. Luckily, it's pretty easy to clean this stuff up once it dries. But while it's wet, it, you know, wants to stick to things and smear on things, and it can get a little bit messy. That's the only reason I try to be a little bit careful. Try to reduce the cleanup time afterwards. All right. One more bin to feed. Let's get these guys out here. Right, with this container, I always feel like I've got to be so careful with this this busted handle. It would really stink if I grabbed it there and the whole thing would fall. Here too, we're covering up in a similar way. We're just not going all the way edge to edge like we were on the last bin. This still does a really nice job, even though it's a little bit less coverage. It's not that much less. Any worms that seem to be hanging out here on this plastic, we're going to try to evict them, just so we don't end up with some dried up dead worms on it. It's for their own good. Here again, right underneath the plastic where the moisture is recirculating, it's just such a nice coating of fresh castings. You can see a little bit of a divot here too. I'm assuming it was the middle where I fed last time. Usually I leave some sort of a marker. I guess when we're done here, we'll use a coffee filter to mark where we last fed, just in case we decide at some point in the future to feed elsewhere. So before we open up the previous feeding zone, I'm going to poke around out here to see how the material at large is progressing. This is very, very similar to the other bin, even though it's, you know, quite a bit older. It's very similar as far as its progress is concerned. I guess maybe a little bit further along. Looks like it could possibly be a candidate for withholding future feedings, letting it just sort of wind down, let them finish any little scraps of sticks and stems remaining in the material, so that we can start gearing up for migrating them out of the material and harvesting. So it's always fun poking around in a bin that you know for sure is really heavily populated. Now down here at the bottom, what am I hitting? A whole bunch of matted down leaves, bedding materials, and now I'm actually bumping into some of the food that was added down here in the middle. Alright, you know, I guess for a bin this age, you would expect some of that material that's at the bottom to have gotten somewhat churned up and eaten, but I don't want to have just stuff matted against the bottom of the bin. I'm going to get that stuff sort of suspended within the material, get it up off the bottom, so that the worms can spend some time dealing with that as well. It doesn't really get broken down if it's, you know, resting against the bottom of your bin. I was a little surprised. Maybe I just haven't really dug down that deep in this bin. It's unusual. Just when you continue feeding down the middle, you sort of focus your attention only over there. You sometimes neglect the outer reaches of the bin and forget what's happening over there. So I'm glad I noticed that and had a chance to sort of stir things up a bit. Certainly no shortage of bedding materials down low, and I have to assume we're going to find the same thing down here too, so I'm going to make sure that we're not left with any of that. If I can do so here really quickly, I'm going to just pull up these little clumps of leaves off the bottom and sort of stir them into the castings material. Otherwise you would consider this material to be more or less done, but now that we're sort of stirring some more food items and bedding type material into it, now that material is going to have a little bit more time before it can really be considered as finished off. This material really is pretty far along. It's really beautiful stuff. All these sticks and stems coming up with this leaf matter that I'm stirring up off the bottom. Some of it is like just, I can hear it snapping and breaking as I'm bringing it up because it's got these somewhat larger little sticks in it. Get all that stuff back up into the material, get it into service. Doesn't do anybody any good if it's resting on the bottom. Got all that, whole bunch of it here. And it's, you know, it's occupied by worms. There's definitely worms hanging out in it and around it, so it's not being neglected. But I think it'll only do good to be, you know, stirred up and be more available from all directions rather than just being stuck to the bottom of the bin. Okay, well, I'm kind of glad that we went to that extent. As we get closer and closer to the rim of the container, it gets more and more difficult to, you know, probe down into the bin that way because there's just nowhere to put the stuff. You know, you want to push it off to the side, but you have no space. So I'm going to try to excavate a little bit of a gap down the middle here without making a mess, or at least I'm going to try not to make a mess. I'm going to scoop some of this stuff up to the sides and give us room to add some fresh food. I didn't go crazy trying to pick out all these Brussels sprouts. They just came up with each handful, so they're all over the place kind of. There's a mango seed, all kinds of stuff from previous feedings. All these worms squirming around, they're going to just collapse this opening that I created, so why don't I get this feeding over with really quickly before I have to start over in terms of excavating this hole. And stop doing so much exploration and just get the task at hand completed. Here too, I'm just going to use some leaves as bedding. The coffee that I bought down here, let's see how much we've got. It's a pretty generous amount. Hopefully they can handle it. You saw how many worms are in here. I got a feeling they can handle it. I hope they can. I guess before we start adding the fresh food, let's see if we can pick out some of the food that they'd already been working on here. Some of the old food and the old bedding that they were already in the process of consuming. Try to get the larger bits back down where they belong. There's lots of worms in this material and they're just, you know, right beneath the surface. As soon as I pile them all up, they squirm out of view, but they don't go very far. So they're all right there. Okay, we're running out of room here. I've already piled in coffee, the old food. Let's give them what remains here. 2 carrots, some cantaloupe rinds, some banana peel, all kinds of goodies. This is a really busy bin, so why don't we give them even one more carrot and one more banana peel. That is quite a generous feeding. I got a feeling they're going to do just fine with it. I am not worried. Let's Let's make sure we've got some grit in here too, go along with the food. Very busy bin. Going to top off with just a little bit more leafy matter across the top. And we'll start leveling off here. Don't know what to do. If I can get a few new worm bins running, then I wouldn't worry so much kind of sending this one into a starving mode. By starving, they would not be starving, that's for sure. There's tons of food in this bin. And if they just didn't receive any new food, they'd just be required to focus their attention on what's in here already. And then we'd be that much closer to having a tub full of finished castings. Before we close up, I'm going to give this bin a mark or two to show where we last fed. Kind of tradition to use these coffee filters, so I'm just trying to keep to it. By promoting all this recirculating moisture with these plastic sheets, I get so much activity on the top that one of these pieces of paper that I usually use to mark where I fed gets broken down 1, 2, 3. The worms just go crazy. They're all over the top. They're nibbling on that paper as they come and go. And it usually doesn't seem to last more than a week or two anymore. I used to be able to let those coffee filters that I use as feeding zone indicators go for weeks and weeks before they started to break down. But not anymore, not since I'm using these plastic sheets on top. I'm sold. Try to keep the clean side clean. All right, very nice. All right, I think we're done here. And before I go, I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, then as always, please remember to give me a quick thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And also consider becoming a subscriber to the channel as well. That's really appreciated too. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.